The dream versus the real lighter standing in Independence, Missouri. And it's April of 1847. The air smells like manure and wood smoke, mixed with the yeasty scent of bread baking in someone's outdoor oven. Around you, hundreds of families mill about in organized chaos, their voices creating a constant hum of anxiety and excitement. Children dart between wagons, their laughter piercing through the deeper rumble of men's voices, haggling over oxen prices, arguing about which trail captain to follow, debating whether to leave now or wait another week for the grass to grow taller on the plains. Your own children cling to your skirts, wide-eyed and overwhelmed. Your husband is somewhere in the crowd, making final arrangements, and you're trying not to think about what you've left behind. Back home, though, you can't call it home anymore, can you? You sold almost everything. The house your grandfather built, your mother's china cabinet, the rocking chair where you nursed all 3 of your babies. You kept only what would fit in a single wagon. A wooden box not much bigger than a large closet on wheels, and even that feels too heavy for the oxen to pull 2,000 miles. You packed flour and bacon, dried beans and coffee, a cast iron skillet, 1 good pot, blankets that won't be enough when you reach the mountains, seeds for planting, your husband's tools, a rifle, and a small trunk with the family Bible, 1 quilt your grandmother made, and a daguerreotype of your parents. Everything else, every other physical reminder of your entire life up to this moment, is gone, sold to strangers or given away. The wagon before you looks impossibly small now. It looked sufficient back home, but standing here, knowing it has to contain your entire existence for the next 6 months, it feels like a cruel joke. The canvas cover is pulled tight over the wooden hoops, bleached white and already showing smudges of dirt, even though you haven't left yet. Your husband paid nearly $1,000 for this outfit, the wagon, the oxen, the supplies, the passage with the wagon train. $1,000. That's more money than your family saw in 2 years of farming. You went into debt for this dream, and now there's no turning back, even if you wanted to. And part of you wants to. You won't say it out loud, not to your husband, who staked everything on this venture. Not to your children, who need to believe their parents know what they're doing. But standing here in the dust and noise, you feel a cold weight of dread settling in your stomach. What if this is a mistake? What if the stories about Oregon, about free land and fertile soil and new beginnings, what if they're lies told by land speculators and politicians who've never walked a single mile of the trail they're encouraging you to follow? You've heard other stories too, whispered ones. The Donner Party was just last year. Everyone knows what happened there. Trapped in the Sierra Nevada, the unspeakable things desperate people did to survive. You've heard about cholera sweeping through wagon trains, killing people so fast they died before nightfall after seeming healthy at dawn. You've heard about river crossings gone wrong, wagons tipping, children swept away, entire families drowned. You've heard about graves lining the trail, so many graves that in some stretches you'll pass one every few hundred yards. But you've also heard about land, 320 acres, free to any family willing to claim it and work it. Land your children could inherit, land that might make them prosperous in ways you never were. Back in Missouri or Illinois or wherever you came from, land was expensive and getting more so, already claimed. already divided among families who got there first. Your husband worked someone else's farm. Or maybe he had a small plot that wasn't enough, that would be even less when divided among your sons. Out west, the politicians promised there was land enough for everyone. Rich land, empty land. You just had to get there. Empty land. That phrase bothers you when you let yourself think about it. The land isn't empty, of course. People already live. They're native people who've lived there for longer than you can imagine. But the government says it's empty, says it's available, says it's America's manifest destiny to spread from ocean to ocean. And who are you to argue with destiny? You're just a farmer's wife trying to give your children a better future. You don't think about the people being displaced. You can't. You have to believe this is right, because you've already given up everything for it. The trail captain is calling for attention now, his voice booming over the crowd. Tomorrow at dawn, you leave. 2,000 miles ahead. The guidebook your husband bought says it takes 5 to 6 months if all goes well. If you make 15 miles a day, if the weather cooperates, if the oxen stay healthy, if you don't get lost, if disease doesn't strike, if you time it right to get through the mountains before snow. So many ifs. The guidebook makes it sound manageable, almost routine. It lists the landmarks you'll pass: Fort Kearny, Chimney Rock, Fort Laramie, Independence Rock, South Pass, Fort Hall, names that mean nothing to you now but will become the markers of your existence. The way you measure time and distance and how much farther you have to go. You look at your wagon again, at your children, at your husband returning from his errands with that determined set to his jaw that means he's made up his mind and won't be swayed. You look at the other families around you, hundreds of them, all standing at this same edge, all about to step off into the unknown. Some of them won't make it. The statistics are brutal. 1 in 10 will die on the trail. 1 in 10. You look at the faces around you and do the math. Out of every 10 people you see right now, 1 will be dead before they see Oregon. Which one? The young couple over there, newlyweds by the look of them, standing close together, his arm around her waist. The family with 6 children, the oldest barely 12, the youngest an infant. The elderly man who insisted on coming despite his grown son's protests, determined to see the Pacific before he dies. Or will it be you, your husband, one of your children? You push the thought away, but it lingers like smoke. This is the reality they don't tell you in the recruiting pamphlets, in the newspaper advertisements, in the glowing letters sent back by early settlers who want more families to join them, who need more people to build communities, who maybe don't want to admit they're lonely and afraid in that vast empty land they claimed. The Oregon Trail isn't an adventure. It's not a grand expedition. It's a 2,000-mile-long gamble with death. A rolling cemetery stretching across plains and mountains and deserts. And you're about to join it. The sun is setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. And you should find beauty in it, but instead you just feel tired. Tomorrow, before dawn, you'll yoke the oxen and take your place in line. And you'll start walking, because despite what you imagined, you won't be riding in that wagon. The wagon is for supplies and the sick and the very young. Everyone else walks. 15 miles a day. For 6 months, you'll walk until your feet bleed, until your legs go numb, until walking becomes so automatic you do it in your sleep. But tonight, you're still here, still on the edge of the known world, still able to turn back. Except you can't, can you? You've sold everything. You've said goodbye. You've committed. Tomorrow, the journey begins, and whatever happens over the next 2,000 miles, you'll face it because you have no other choice. The dream of Oregon pulled you here. The reality of the trail will test whether you survive to see it. Asterisk. Preparing to leave what you're leaving behind. Asterisk. The months before departure were a blur of impossible decisions and mounting dread. You had to reduce your entire life down to 1,800 pounds. That's all the wagon could carry without breaking down or exhausting the oxen. 1,800 pounds to contain everything you'd need for 6 months on the trail and to start a new life at the end. When you first heard that number, it sounded like plenty. Then you started making lists. Asterisk. Flour, 200 pounds minimum. Bacon, 150 pounds. Dried beans, rice, coffee, sugar, salt, baking soda, dried fruit, if you could afford it. Cooking equipment, that cast iron skillet, the big pot, a Dutch oven, tin plates and cups, utensils, tools, axe, hammer, saw, nails, rope, spare wagon parts, because something will break. Clothing for 4 people through all seasons and years of wear ahead. Blankets and quilts. A tent for when it rains. Medical supplies, though you barely know what to bring. Laudanum for pain. Whiskey for emergencies. Bandages, maybe some calomel, though you've heard it does more harm than good. Seeds for the farm you'll plant. Your husband's hunting rifle and ammunition. A water barrel. And somehow, in whatever space remains, the small personal items that make life bearable. The family Bible, 1 toy for each child, maybe a book or 2. You made lists and crossed things off and rewrote the lists and lay awake at night, wondering if you were bringing the right things. The guidebooks were confident in their recommendations, but you'd heard stories of people arriving in Oregon with 300 pounds of bacon gone rancid, or realizing they'd packed mining equipment for California when they needed farm tools for Oregon, or bringing furniture they had to abandon in the desert when the oxen started dying. How were you supposed to know what you'd really need when you'd never done this before, when you'd never been farther than 50 miles from where you were born? Your mother's china cabinet was the first thing to go. Your husband insisted it was beautiful but impractical, heavy, fragile, impossible to justify when you needed space for food. You sold it to a neighbor for a fraction of what it was worth, and she looked so pleased with her bargain while you tried not to cry. That cabinet had been in your family for 3 generations. Your grandmother brought it from Pennsylvania. Your mother served Sunday dinners on those plates. You'd imagined passing it to your daughter someday. Now it would stay here with strangers while you walked into the wilderness. The furniture went next. The beds, the tables, the chairs your grandfather made. You kept none of it. You'd sleep on the ground or in the wagon for the next 6 months. And when you reached Oregon, you'd build new furniture from the trees you'd cut from land you didn't own yet. The bookshelf with the 12 books you'd collected over your lifetime gone. You kept the Bible and 1 other, the smallest one, and sold the rest. The rocking chair where you'd rocked all your babies nearly broke your heart, but it went to everything went. The house itself sold for less than it was worth because everyone knew you were desperate, knew you had to sell, knew you'd take whatever offer came, You raised $1,000. A fortune, and somehow not nearly enough. The wagon alone cost $60, though you'd heard of families paying twice that for better quality. The oxen you needed at least 4, preferably 6 cost another $150 for decent animals. Oxen, not horses. Horses were faster, but ate too much and couldn't survive on prairie grass alone. Mules were strong but expensive and stubborn. Oxen were slow, patient, strong, and could eat anything. You learned to think about livestock the way you'd never had to before, calculating their value against your family's survival. The supplies cost hundreds more. Flour was cheap in Missouri, but you needed so much of it. Bacon kept well, but wasn't cheap. Coffee and sugar felt like luxuries you couldn't afford. But your husband insisted some mornings coffee would be the only thing keeping you moving. You bought what the guidebook recommended and hoped it was enough, hoped it wasn't too much, hoped you weren't forgetting something critical. Then there were the fees, the guide's fee, the passage with the wagon train, the ferry crossings you'd have to pay for along the way. Every dollar spent was a dollar you'd never see again. And if you turned back, if you gave up, you'd arrive home penniless, with nothing to show for it. The debt was its own kind of trap. You had to make it to Oregon now because you couldn't afford not to. The emotional cost was harder to calculate. Your parents stood in the doorway of the house where you'd grown up, where they still lived, and watched you load the wagon. Your mother cried and tried to hide it. Your father shook your husband's hand and told him to take care of his daughter, his grandchildren, and you all knew what he wasn't saying. This was probably goodbye forever. People didn't come back from Oregon. It was too far, too expensive, too difficult. If you left, you'd likely never see your parents again. You'd never visit their graves. They'd never meet any more grandchildren you might have. Your children would forget their faces. Your mother pressed a small package into your hands at the last minute. The quilt she'd been working on all winter, pieced from scraps of fabric from your childhood dresses. Your wedding dress, clothes your children had outgrown. Every square told a story, and now those stories would travel with you. You promised to write, knowing letters would take months to arrive, if they arrived at all. You promised to name the next baby after her. You promised to remember home. Then you climbed onto the wagon seat and didn't look back, because if you looked back, you'd break down completely. The children didn't fully understand. Your youngest, only 4, thought this was an adventure, a grand trip to somewhere new and exciting. Your middle child, 7, was anxious but trusting. Your oldest, 10, was old enough to sense the adult's fear and had been withdrawn for weeks, grieving friends and familiar places in silence. You tried to make it exciting for them, tried to frame it as a brave journey. But how do you explain to children that you're dragging them into danger, that they might die on this trail, that you're choosing this despite the risks because staying felt like slow death, and at least this offered hope? The night before departure, you couldn't sleep. You lay in the wagon bed. You'd already sold the house, were camping in the wagon in Townland, listened to hundreds of other families doing the same, their whispered conversations carrying in the darkness, their children's fretful crying, their animals shifting and lowing. Tomorrow it would all begin. Tomorrow you'd join the line of wagons stretching west. Part of a migration that had been happening for years now would continue for years more. Thousands upon thousands of people, all making this same desperate gamble. You'd read about migrations in the Bible, about people leaving everything to follow a promise to a better land. It felt sacred and foolish at once. Moses led his people for 40 years, but at least he had God's direct guidance. You had a guidebook written by a man who made the journey once, and a trail captain you'd just met who seemed confident, but who knows? Maybe he was as uncertain as everyone else, and just better at hiding it. In the darkness, you recited what you'd packed, what you'd left behind, what you owed, what you hoped for. You thought about the family china feeding strangers. You thought about your mother's quilt, folded carefully in the trunk. You thought about the 2,000 miles ahead and tried to imagine them, but you couldn't. Distance like that was abstract, meaningless. 15 miles a day sounded manageable until you multiplied it by 130 days. Until you pictured walking from here to the horizon and then doing that again and again and again for half a year. But there was no turning back now. Everything was sold, every bridge burned. At dawn, you'd yoke the oxen, take your place in line, and start walking toward a dream that might kill you before you ever reached it. Asterisk. The first week's broken illusions. Asterisk. The first morning. You woke at 4 a.m. to the sound of the trail captain's horn and the immediate chaos of hundreds of families trying to break camp simultaneously. The darkness was absolute, broken only by cook fires hastily lit, casting dancing shadows on canvas wagon covers. You stumbled out of the wagon, disoriented and already exhausted despite having just woken, and started making breakfast while your husband went to yoke the oxen. Breakfast was simple. Bacon fried in the skillet, bread if you had time to bake it the night before, coffee that tasted like mud and salvation. The children were cranky, confused about the early hour, and you had to dress them and feed them and pack up the bedding and clean the cooking equipment and make sure nothing was left behind. All in the darkness, all in under an hour. By the time the wagon train started moving, you'd already been awake for 2 hours and felt like you'd worked a full day. Then you started walking. The wagon lurched forward with a creak of wood and leather, and you took your place beside it, one hand resting on the side rail, your children nearby. Your husband walked with the oxen, keeping them moving, keeping them in line, and you walked. The sun wasn't even fully up yet, and you were already walking the first day. You managed 12 miles before the captain called for camp. 12 miles. You thought you might die. Your feet, in boots that seemed fine back home, developed blisters within hours. Your legs ached. Your back hurt from the unnatural posture of walking slightly hunched beside the wagon. The sun beat down relentlessly once it rose, and there was no shade, nowhere to escape it, just endless rolling prairie, and you walking through it like a mule. You understood now why the guidebook said to bring extra boots. You'd wear through several pairs before Oregon. That first night, you were too tired to eat. You had to cook anyways. The family needed food, and cooking was women's work, trail or no trail. You made beans and bacon, the same meal you'd make almost every night for the next 6 months, and you ate mechanically while trying not to think about how many more days of this stretched ahead. 130 days of waking at 4 a.m., walking 15 miles, cooking over an open fire, sleeping on the ground, and then doing it all again and again and again. By the end of the first week, you'd stopped thinking about it in terms of days. It was too overwhelming. You thought instead about making it to Fort Kearny, the first major landmark, still weeks away. You thought about making it to the noon rest. You thought about making it through the morning. Eventually, you'd learn to think only about the next step, and the next, and the next, because that was all you could handle. The walking itself was monotonous beyond description. 15 miles a day sounds adventurous until you're actually doing it. The scenery barely changed, just grass and sky, grass and sky. Occasionally a creek or a rise in the land, but mostly just endless sameness. You walked in a line of wagons that stretched for miles, eating the dust kicked up by those ahead of you, choking on it, feeling it settle in your hair and clothes and eyes. The dust was inescapable. You'd shake it out of your blankets at night and find more in the morning. You'd wipe your face, and the rag would come away brown. You'd cough it up for days. The social dynamics of the wagon train revealed themselves quickly. Your position in line mattered enormously. Those at the front had cleaner air and first pick of camping spots, while those at the back suffered worse dust and often had to settle for areas where all the good grass was already grazed by others' animals. Arguments broke out over line position, over whose oxen were too slow, over children running between wagons, over men who shirked their guard duties at night. You'd thought everyone would pull together, united by common purpose, but desperation made people selfish. And after a few weeks of grinding hardship, patience wore thin. Women formed their own society within the train. You'd walk alongside other women, sharing the burden of watching the collective children, trading recipes for making coffee go further or rendering the endless bacon more palatable. You'd help each other with laundry when you camped near a creek-hand laundry. On the trail was brutal, scrubbing clothes against rocks, trying to get the dirt out, knowing it was futile. Everything would be filthy again tomorrow. Some women you liked. Others irritated you beyond measure, but you were stuck with them for 6 months. So you learned to bite your tongue and nod and smile. The men had their own hierarchies, their own arguments. Your husband came back to camp each evening with stories of disputes over route choices, over how fast to travel, over whether to rest on Sundays or push through. Some families were religious and insisted on a day of rest, believing God would punish them otherwise. Others thought the delay was dangerous, that every lost day increased the risk of being caught in mountain snows. The trail captain tried to mediate, but he was just one man managing hundreds of strong opinions. Then there were the accidents. The first death in your wagon train happened on day 4. A young boy, maybe 6 years old, fell while trying to climb into a moving wagon. The wheel went over his leg, crushing it. He died 2 days later from infection, screaming in agony the whole time while his mother held him and prayed and begged God for mercy that never came. They buried him beside the trail and marked it with a wooden cross and moved on the same day because you couldn't afford to stop. Couldn't afford to grieve properly. His mother rode in the wagon after that, just sat there staring at nothing, and the other women took turns caring for her other children. You saw your first grave markers within a week of leaving Independence. They became more frequent as you traveled wooden crosses, piles of rocks, sometimes just names carved into trees. Sarah Ann, aged 3 months. Joseph Miller, aged 52, beloved husband, beloved daughter. Sometimes the graves had dates, Sometimes just names, sometimes nothing at all, just a cross that could mark anyone. You learned not to look too closely at them, learned not to calculate how many you passed each day, because the math was horrifying. River crossings were terrifying from the start. Even the small creeks made you anxious. The wagon had to ford through, the water sometimes coming up to the wagon bed, and you'd watch anxiously to make sure nothing tipped, nothing floated away, no children slipped and got swept downstream. The adults waded through, holding children above the water, and the shock of cold water after hours of hot sun should have been refreshing, but was mostly just disorienting. You were always wet or always dry, never comfortable. By the second week, you realized the guidebook had lied about almost everything. It made the trail sound manageable, civilized even. It talked about landmarks and good camping spots and ample game for hunting. It didn't mention the grinding monotony, the way days blurred together into endless walking, the way your body hurt in places you didn't know could hurt, the way your mind went numb from sheer exhaustion. It didn't mention the children's constant complaints. They were bored, they were tired, their feet hurt, they wanted to go home. It didn't mention the sick dread that set in when you realized how far you'd come and how much farther you had to go, and how neither direction offered any comfort. The food became tedious almost immediately. Bacon and beans, beans and bacon. Sometimes rice if you had time, bread if you'd baked it. Though baking on the trail was difficult, you needed to let dough rise while traveling. Find time to bake it when you camped, all while managing everything else. Coffee that got weaker as you rationed it. Some families hunted buffalo or antelope, but game wasn't as plentiful as promised, and hunting took time and energy most men didn't have. After a full day of managing oxen, you were hungry all the time. Not starving, you had food, but constantly, gnawingly hungry in a way you'd never experienced before. The physical labor of walking 15 miles while managing children and camping and cooking burned through calories faster than the monotonous diet could replace them. You watched yourself grow thinner, watched your children's faces become gaunt, and tried not to panic about whether you'd packed enough food. 3 weeks in, you passed a wagon being abandoned. The oxen had dead illness, exhaustion. No one was sure, and the family was sorting through their possessions, deciding what they could carry and what had to stay. A woman was crying over a rocking chair, the same style as the one you'd sold back home. And you wanted to tell her it wasn't worth crying over. It was just a chair, but you said nothing because you understood. It wasn't about the chair. It was about everything the chair represented: home, comfort, normalcy, the life they'd left behind and would never get back. You walked past without stopping. The wagon train didn't stop for anyone. That was the rule. Keep moving. Stay together. Stop for nothing except the scheduled rest at noon and camp at night. If your wagon broke, you fixed it fast or got left behind. If someone died, you grieved while walking. The trail had its own brutal logic, and you either adapted or you didn't make it. At night, lying under the wagon on the hard ground, you'd given up the tent. It was too much work to set up. You'd listen to the sounds of the camp settling, animals shifting, children crying, couples arguing in low voices, someone playing a harmonica badly, always badly. You'd stare at the underside of the wagon, at the canvas cover above it, and try to remember why you'd thought this was a good idea. The dream of Oregon seemed impossibly far away, abstract, probably a lie. The reality was this: dirt and dust and pain and walking and walking and walking, day after day, with no end in sight. But you'd wake at 4 a.m. when the horn sounded, and you'd make breakfast, and you'd start walking again, because what else could you do? Disease and death, the silent killers, the cholera, started in a wagon 3 spots ahead of yours, and within a week it had killed 11 people in the train. You didn't know it was cholera at first. The woman just seemed tired one morning, complained of stomach cramps, said she felt weak. By afternoon she was vomiting and had diarrhea so severe she was too weak to move. By evening her skin had turned blue-gray and her eyes had sunken into her skull. By the next dawn she was dead, and her husband was showing symptoms. Cholera was the most feared word on the trail, whispered like a curse, and now it was here, in your wagon train, moving among you like an invisible predator. No one understood what caused it. Some said bad water. Others said night air. Others claimed it was God's punishment for greed or sin. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that it killed fast, sometimes within hours, and there was nothing anyone could do except watch people die and pray you weren't next. The symptoms were unmistakable once you'd seen them. It started with stomach cramps and diarrhea. But not normal diarrhea. This was violent, uncontrollable, draining fluid from the body faster than you could replace it. Victims became desperately thirsty, but couldn't keep water down. They'd vomit clear liquid until their stomachs were empty, then vomit bile, then dry heave until their abdominal muscles gave out. Their skin would lose elasticity, becoming loose and gray. Their eyes would sink. Their extremities would turn blue from lack of circulation. They'd develop agonizing muscle cramps in their legs and arms. And through it all, they'd remain conscious, aware, terrified, knowing exactly what was happening as their bodies shut down. You watched a strong man, healthy and robust the day before, reduced to a writhing corpse within 12 hours. You watched his wife try everything. She gave him water he couldn't keep down, whiskey he vomited immediately, laudanum that did nothing for the pain. She prayed over him, wept over him, begged him not to leave her with 4 children on the trail. He died anyway, and she had to bury him that morning and keep moving that same day because the wagon train didn't stop. She rode in the wagon, holding her youngest, staring at nothing. And you wondered if she'd survive the shock, even if she didn't catch the disease. The fear was suffocating. Every stomach rumble made you panic. Every time a child complained of a bellyache, you felt cold terror wash over you. You started watching your family obsessively for symptoms, checking their eyes, their skin, asking constantly how they felt. Your husband told you to stop. You were making everyone anxious, but you couldn't help it. Cholera could take any of them in hours, and you'd be helpless to stop it. The trail captain ordered everyone to boil drinking water, though no one was sure if it helped. You boiled water religiously anyway, adding precious minutes to every meal preparation, because doing something felt better than doing nothing. Some families refused, said boiling was superstition. Said if God wanted them to get cholera, they'd get it regardless. Those families tended to have more deaths, but maybe that was coincidence. Maybe it was judgment. You didn't know and didn't care. You boiled the water. People tried everything to prevent or cure cholera. They dosed themselves with calomel, a mercury compound that probably did more harm than good, causing mercury poisoning on top of everything else. They took opium or laudanum for the pain and cramps, which at least made the dying more bearable. They drank whiskey, thinking alcohol might kill whatever caused the disease. They prayed and anointed the sick with oil, and laid hands on them and begged God for healing that rarely came. They tried home remedies passed down through generations: mustard plasters, hot bricks wrapped in cloth pressed against the abdomen, herbal teas that did nothing but at least showed love and effort. Nothing worked. Cholera killed who it wanted and spared the rest, following no logic anyone could discern. Strong men died while frail elderly survived. Children died while adults were spared, or adults died while children lived. Whole families were wiped out. Other families never had a single case, despite being in the same wagon train, eating the same food, drinking from the same streams. The dying was horrible, but the burying might have been worse. You had to dig graves fast because you couldn't delay the train. Usually, you'd dig down 3 or 4 feet deep, enough to discourage wolves and coyotes, not so deep that it took hours. You'd wrap the body in a blanket or canvas, say a quick prayer, fill the grave, pile rocks on top if you could find any, mark it with a cross made from wagon wood. The whole process took maybe an hour. Then you'd walk away, back to your wagon, and start moving. No funeral service, no gathering of mourners, no time to process the loss. Just bury and move. Sometimes you couldn't even manage that much. Sometimes people died while the wagons were moving, and you'd have to stop right there, bury them beside the trail without ceremony, mark it hastily, and catch up with the train before it got too far ahead. Sometimes graves were shallow because the ground was too hard or you didn't have time. Sometimes there was no marker. Sometimes the grave was just a hole and a pile of dirt, and you had to trust you'd remember where it was, knowing you wouldn't. Knowing that in a week you wouldn't be able to pick it out from the dozens of other graves lining the trail. Mothers buried children and kept walking. Children buried parents and kept walking. Husbands buried wives, wives buried husbands, and kept walking, because stopping meant dying differently, slowly, from exposure and starvation left behind by the train. The grief had no space to exist. You swallowed it, pushed it down, turned it into something hard inside your chest, and walked. But cholera wasn't the only killer. Dysentery was almost as common and nearly as deadly, causing bloody diarrhea and dehydration that could kill in days rather than hours. Typhoid fever struck randomly, causing weeks of suffering. High fever, delirium, terrible abdominal pain, and often death. Mountain fever, which was probably tick-borne typhus or relapsing fever, caused raging fevers and chills and killed more people in the mountains. Measles swept through wagon trains, mostly killing children who'd never been exposed. Pneumonia took people after they'd gotten wet and chilled crossing rivers or caught in rain. Infected wounds became blood poisoning and death, and there were no doctors. Most wagon trains had no one with any medical training beyond folk remedies and hope. Even when trains had a doctor, medical knowledge in 1847 was barely better than folk remedies anyway. Doctors still believed in the 4 humors, still bled patients for almost everything, still prescribed mercury compounds that poisoned people. A skilled doctor might set bones or suture wounds, but against disease, they were nearly useless. You carried a medicine kit, as most families did, laudanum for pain, whiskey for emergencies, and as antiseptic, some bandages. Maybe quinine for fever, though it was expensive. Some families had ipecac to induce vomiting, calomel for digestive issues, camphor for respiratory problems, peppermint oil for nausea. All of it was mostly useless against the diseases that stalked the trail. But having it made you feel slightly less helpless. The psychological toll of constant death was staggering. In normal life, death was significant, marked with ritual and mourning. On the trail, death became routine. You'd pass a fresh grave and note it, clinically, looks recent, probably cholera. Family must have left this morning. You'd see people burying loved ones and feel sympathy, but keep walking, because stopping wouldn't help them and would endanger you. You'd watch children die and feel horrible, but also relieved it wasn't your child. Then feel guilty for the relief. You became numb. It was necessary for survival. If you felt every death fully, you'd go mad or give up. So you developed a kind of emotional callus, a way of witnessing suffering without letting it destroy you. You'd help when you could, sitting with the sick, preparing bodies for burial, taking care of someone's children when they were too ill to manage, but you'd do it with a practiced detachment, saving your deep emotions for your own family, rationing your empathy like you rationed the coffee. Some people couldn't develop that callus. You watched a woman lose her youngest child to cholera, then her husband, then her oldest daughter, all within 2 weeks. After burying her daughter, she walked away from camp and into the prairie and was never seen again. Some said wolves got her. Others said she just kept walking until she died. Either way, the grief killed her as surely as any disease, just more slowly. The worst part was the guilt of survival. Why did your family stay healthy while others died? You hadn't done anything differently. You all ate the same food, drank from the same streams, camped in the same spots. Was it luck? Divine favor? Random chance? And if your family was spared, did that mean you were somehow better, more deserving, more favored by God? Or did it mean nothing? And tomorrow, cholera might take your child as randomly as it had spared them yesterday. You learned not to get too attached to people outside your immediate family. You'd be friendly, helpful, kind, but you wouldn't invest too deeply in relationships, because people died so frequently that deep bonds just meant more grief. You'd see children playing together and consciously not learn all their names because you didn't want to mourn children by name at night. Lying awake, you'd listen to someone coughing in a distant wagon and wonder if it was consumption or just a cold. Wonder if you should check on them or if getting close risked exposure. You'd hear a child crying and wonder if it was illness or just homesickness. You'd hear a woman sobbing and just know from the sound that someone had died. And you'd say a quick prayer for their soul and for the survivors and turn over and try to sleep because you had to wake at 4 a.m. and do it all again. The trail changed you. It had to. You couldn't witness that much death and suffering and remain the person you'd been back in Missouri. Something inside you hardened, became capable of walking past graves, of eating dinner while someone was dying 3 wagons away, of comforting your children about death while feeling nothing yourself except a vague, distant horror that you'd learned to ignore. You'd become someone who could survive this, and you weren't sure if that was strength or just another kind of death, the death of innocence, of softness, of the person who once cried over a china cabinet. But you kept walking, because what else could you do? The land wants you dead. Natural hazards. The first major river crossing came 3 weeks into the journey, and it nearly destroyed your wagon train. The Platte River looked deceptively calm from the bank, wide and shallow, the water rippling over sandbars, but appearances were murderously deceptive. The river was a mile wide in places. The bottom was quicksand that could swallow wagons. The current was stronger than it looked, and the depth changed without warning from ankle-deep to over your head. You watched the first wagon attempt the crossing. The family had hired a guide who claimed to know the safe route, and they started across confidently. Halfway through, the wagon lurched suddenly, tilting as one wheel sank into quicksand. The oxen panicked, thrashing and pulling unevenly. The wagon tipped further. You heard screaming. The mother and children were inside. Men rushed into the water to help, forming a human chain, grabbing the oxen, pushing the wagon, and somehow they got it upright and across. But the family lost half their supplies, waterlogged or washed away. The mother climbed out of the wagon, soaking wet, clutching her baby, and collapsed on the far bank, sobbing. That was the successful crossing. 2 wagons later, a wheel broke in mid. The wagon tipped completely, spilling its contents into the muddy water. The family lost everything: food, clothes, tools, all of it swept downstream or sunk in mud. They had to abandon the wagon, salvage what little floated, and crowd into another family's wagon, now dependent on others' charity to survive. Then came the drowning. A young man, maybe 20, tried to swim across, instead of waiting with the wagon. The current caught him, pulled him under, and he never surfaced. They found his body 2 days later, half a mile downstream, bloated and caught in debris. His widow was 7 months pregnant and now alone on the trail. The other families would help her, but everyone knew her situation was desperate. A pregnant widow with no wagon, no supplies, no husband. How would she survive Oregon? Every river crossing after that filled you with dread. The Snake River, the Green River, the Kansas River, countless unnamed creeks swollen with spring runoff. Each one was a potential death trap. You'd watch other wagons cross first, learning from their routes, seeing where the water was deepest. You'd unload the wagon to lighten it, carry supplies across separately, getting soaked and cold. You'd lead the children across, holding their hands, feeling the current pull at your skirts, the water sometimes chest deep and freezing, your heart pounding with fear that someone would slip, get swept away, disappear under the muddy water forever. The crossing would take hours for the whole train. Then you'd have to reload everything into the wagon. But now it was all wet. Flour got damp and started molding. Clothes stayed wet for days. Blankets became clammy and cold. The wagon would swelled from moisture, then dried and cracked in the sun. Nothing on the trail stayed in good condition. Everything broke down, wore out, deteriorated under the constant stress. Beyond the rivers, the land itself seemed hostile to human survival. The storms were violent beyond anything you'd experienced back home. Thunderstorms would roll across the prairie with nowhere to hide, lightning striking the open ground, thunder so loud it made the children scream, rain so heavy you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. You'd huddle under the wagon or inside it, trying to keep dry impossible while the storm raged. Lightning struck close enough that you could smell it, that sharp ozone scent, and hear it crack like the world splitting open. One storm killed 3 oxen in a nearby wagon train, struck by lightning while yoked together. Their owner lost his ability to continue and had to sell his remaining goods and hitch a ride with another family. Hailstorms were even worse. Hail on the prairie came down like God throwing rocks, stones the size of eggs battering the wagon cover, bruising anyone caught outside, killing small animals, occasionally injuring people. You watched hail shred a wagon's canvas cover to tatters in minutes. That family had to buy replacement canvas at Fort Laramie, paying an extortionate price because the fort traders knew desperate people had no choice. The heat was relentless once summer came. The sun beat down from a cloudless sky, reflecting off pale dirt and dry grass. And there was no shade anywhere, no trees, just endless exposure. Temperatures reached over 100 degrees, and you walked through it, sweating through your clothes, rationing water because you didn't know when you'd find the next stream. People suffered heat exhaustion, heat stroke, collapsed beside the trail, and had to be loaded into wagons already crowded with supplies. The very young and very old suffered most. You watched an elderly woman die from heat, just stopped breathing one afternoon. Her body unable to regulate temperature anymore. The dust in heat was suffocating. It rose in clouds from hundreds of wagon wheels and thousands of animal hooves hanging in the still air, coating everything, getting in your eyes and nose and mouth and lungs. You'd cough up brown phlegm for hours after a particularly dusty day. The constant irritation led to eye infections, respiratory problems, made everyone miserable and short-tempered. Then there were the nights, especially in the mountains, freezing cold, even in summer. You'd sweat through 100-degree day, then shiver through a near-freezing night. The temperature swings were brutal on bodies already stressed by walking and poor food. People got sick from the constant exposure. Pneumonia struck frequently. You'd wake with frost on your blankets, your breath visible, your fingers numb, and have to somehow make a fire and cook breakfast while shaking with cold water was always a problem. The guidebook marked water sources, but sometimes you'd arrive to find a stream dried up, or so alkaline it would make you sick, or contaminated by dead animals upstream. You learned to scout ahead, to look for moving water rather than standing pools, to boil everything. But sometimes there was no water, and you'd go a full day or more with your water barrel running low, rationing sips, the oxen suffering, everyone's lips cracking from dehydration. Before you'd finally reach the next source, the alkali water in some regions was particularly evil. It looked fine, clear, and clean, but drinking it caused violent diarrhea and vomiting. The oxen would drink it because they didn't know better than sicken and sometimes die. You'd watch a strong ox decline over days from alkali poisoning, becoming too weak to pull, eventually dying beside the trail. Losing an ox was catastrophic. You needed at least 4 to pull the wagon, and replacing them on the trail was expensive, if you could even find them for sale. Stampedes happened with terrifying suddenness. Something would spook the animals, lightning, a predator. Sometimes nothing discernible, and suddenly hundreds of oxen and cattle would be running in panic. If you were in their path, you could be trampled. If your animals joined the stampede, they might run for miles before exhausting themselves. costing you a full day of travel to track them down. Some animals were never recovered, lost in the chaos, leaving families unable to continue. The plains weren't flat like you'd imagined. There were ravines, gullies, steep hills, rocky stretches that broke wagon wheels and axles. You'd be walking along and suddenly have to navigate down a steep embankment, men pushing and pulling to keep wagons from tipping. Then up the other side, oxen straining, everyone helping push. One wagon in your train tipped going down a hillside, rolled completely over, smashing two pieces. The family lost everything. They had to abandon the journey, try to hitch back east with another train. Their dreams of Oregon dead in a Kansas ravine. Getting lost was a constant fear, especially in mountain passes where one wrong turn could add days or lead you to an impassable cliff. The guidebook was vague about many sections. Landmarks mentioned might not be recognizable. Trails diverged, and you had to choose without knowing which was right. Some trails led to water and good camping. Others led to dead ends, box canyons, or waterless stretches that could kill you. The trail captain supposedly knew the way, but some captains were more confident than knowledgeable, leading wagon trains astray through sheer stubbornness. Injuries were constant and often serious. Wagon wheels ran over feet, crushing bones. Axes slipped during woodcutting, causing deep gashes. People fell from wagons and broke limbs. Children burned themselves on cooking fires. Men got kicked by animals, suffering broken ribs or worse. And there was no doctor, no hospital, no proper medical care. You treated injuries with whiskey as antiseptic, laudanum for pain, bandages, and prayer. Broken bones were set by whoever seemed most confident, often healing poorly, leaving people with permanent limps or deformities. Infections turned minor injuries deadly. A small cut could become infected, red and swollen and hot to touch. Then blood poisoning would set in. You'd watch the red lines spread up someone's arm from an infected finger, knowing they'd probably die, and there was nothing you could do except keep the wound clean and hope. Sometimes people survived. More often they didn't. Snake bites happened regularly in certain regions. Rattlesnakes were common, hiding in grass or under rocks. Children playing would nearly step on them, or men gathering firewood would reach into a pile where a snake was coiled. The bite itself might not kill you, but the panic, the venom, the lack of treatment often did. People tried cutting the wound and sucking out venom, probably useless and possibly harmful, applying tourniquets so tight they caused more damage. Mostly, you just waited to see if the person would survive, keeping them calm, treating symptoms, hoping. The physical pain became your constant companion. Blisters on your feet burst and reformed and burst again. Your legs ached from walking, a deep bone tiredness that never fully went away. Your back hurt from the constant strain of walking while managing children and supplies. Your hands were rough and cracked, the skin splitting from constant sun and work and alkali water. Your face was sunburned despite your bonnet, your lips perpetually chapped. Your whole body hurt all the time. A background of pain you learned to ignore, because everyone hurt and complaining was pointless. You watched yourself change physically. Your clothes hung loose as you lost weight, despite eating everything you could. Your face became gaunt, your hands bony. You were 32 years old and looked 50. Your husband looked older too, weathered and worn. The children looked small and fragile, their eyes too large in thin faces. Everyone on the trail had that same look, hollow, exhausted, aged beyond their years. The constant message from the land was clear. You don't belong here. This place will kill you if it can. The rivers will drown you. The storms will strike you down. The heat will cook you. The cold will freeze you. The animals will trample you. The very ground will break your wagons and your bones. Nature was indifferent to human suffering, and the trail was nature at its most brutal. You were an intruder, crossing hostile territory, and the land made you pay for every mile. But you kept going, because behind you was impossible, and ahead was Oregon, and you were too far in to turn back. So you forded the rivers and survived the storms, and walked through the heat, and froze at night, and somehow, impossibly, continued to survive, day after day, mile after mile, waiting for the land to finally succeed in killing you. The women's burden, invisible labor you, woke before the horn sounded, because you needed the extra time. 4 a.m. meant you'd been asleep for maybe 5 hours, but you couldn't afford to waste the minutes between the horn and departure. While the camp was still dark and quiet, except for a few other women also stirring early, you'd start the fire. Building a fire on the trail was an art you'd learned quickly, gathering dried buffalo chips when wood wasn't available. Yes, you burned animal dung because it was fuel, and you couldn't afford to be squeamish. You'd coax the fire to life with the precious dry kindling you'd collected the night before. Get the coffee pot on, start frying bacon in the skillet. By the time your husband woke to handle the oxen, you needed to have breakfast ready. Bacon, beans, if they'd cooked overnight, bread, if you'd baked it, coffee, always. The men would eat and then immediately start with the animals and wagons. Their work was visible, obvious, the kind of labor everyone recognized as necessary. Your work was invisible, expected, never remarked upon unless it wasn't done. While your husband yoked the oxen, you fed the children, packed the bedding, cleaned the dishes, stored the food, made sure everything was secured in the wagon, filled the water barrel if you were near a source, and somehow got everyone ready to move, all in under an hour. Every single morning, for 6 months, then you walked. All day you walked, but unlike the men who walked with the animals or rode occasionally, you walked while managing children. Your youngest was 4 and couldn't walk 15 miles. So you carried her when she got tired, hoisting her onto your hip, feeling the strain in your back, your arms, continuing to walk with her weight added to your own exhaustion. Your middle child would whine and complain and need constant supervision to keep him from wandering off, or getting too close to other wagons, or falling behind. Your oldest helped, but she was 10 and shouldn't have to mother her siblings. Yet here she was, doing exactly that, because you couldn't manage it all alone. While walking, you also had to think about the next meal. At the noon rest, you'd have an hour to feed everyone. That meant you needed to have food prepared or ready to prepare quickly. More bacon, hard bread, maybe dried fruit if you were being optimistic about supplies. No time for anything elaborate. Everyone would eat standing up or sitting on the ground, and then you'd pack everything again and keep moving. The afternoon walking was worse, because you were already tired and there were still hours to go. The children got fussier as the day wore on. Your youngest would cry to be carried more. You'd walk with her on your hip, feeling your body scream in protest. Unable to put her down because there was nowhere safe for a 4-year-old to be except beside you. Other women would sometimes take turns carrying each other's children, a shared burden that helped everyone. But there were always more children than women with free arms. When camp was finally called, usually around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, the men's work was mostly done for the day. They'd unhitch the oxen, tend to the animals, maybe stand guard, rotation later, but many would rest. The women's work had only just begun. You had to make dinner, the main meal of the day, and it had to be substantial because everyone was hungry after 15 miles of walking. That meant building another fire, more buffalo chips, more coaxing flames from nothing, and cooking beans that took hours to soften. Baking bread if you had time and energy. Always more bacon because bacon kept and everything else was risky. You'd cook in a cast iron pot over an open fire, in wind or rain or dust, with children needing attention, with 100 other tasks waiting while dinner cooked. You'd handle laundry if you were camped near water. Laundry on the trail was brutal work. You'd carry the dirty clothes to the stream or river, kneel on the bank, and scrub each piece against rocks, trying to get out dirt that had become part of the fabric. Your hands would be raw and bleeding from the rough work, the alkali water burning the cuts. But the clothes needed washing because there weren't enough changes for everyone to wear dirty clothes for 6 months. You'd wring out the heavy, wet fabric dresses, shirts, children's clothes, all of it soaked and heavy, and carry it back to camp to drape over wagon wheels or ropes strung between wagons, hoping it would dry before morning. Often it wouldn't, and everyone would wear damp clothes the next day. Dinner would finally be ready around dark. Everyone would eat. The men would compliment the meal or not, and then you'd clean everything. The dishes had to be scrubbed, more trips to carry water, more scrubbing, your hands never not working. The fire had to be managed until the coals died enough to be safe. The children had to be put to bed, which meant helping them into night, tucking them into the wagon or under it, dealing with their fears of the dark and the strange sounds and the hardness of the ground. Only then, maybe around 8 or 9 p.m., could you rest. Maybe, if nothing else needed doing, if no one was sick, if the mending could wait until tomorrow, you'd lie down exhausted beyond description, knowing you'd wake in a few hours to do it all again. And this didn't count the additional labor that came, irregularly but inevitably, caring for the sequin. Someone in your family or the train got ill. Women did the nursing, sitting up all night with fevered children, changing soiled bedding, trying to get water into dehydrated patients, preparing special foods for those too weak to eat regular meals, all while maintaining the normal routine because the healthy still needed to be fed and the wagon still had to move. Then there was childbirth. You'd seen 2 women give birth on the trail so far, and it was horrifying in its primitive conditions. No privacy. The birth happened in a wagon with only a canvas cover between the laboring woman and the entire camp. No doctor or midwife, usually, just other women helping as best they could with limited knowledge and no equipment. No time to recover. The woman would give birth one day and the wagon would move the next, and she'd ride in the wagon, bleeding and in pain, cradling a newborn, trying to establish breastfeeding while bouncing over ruts in the trail. One woman hemorrhaged badly during birth, and you thought she'd die. But she survived through sheer stubbornness, and because the other women packed her with rags and prayed and somehow stopped the bleeding. You were terrified of becoming pregnant on the trail. You and your husband still had relations. You were married. It was expected. Even on the trail, people found privacy and intimacy, but the thought of being pregnant while walking 15 miles a day, of giving birth in a wagon, of caring for a newborn while managing everything else, filled you with dread. You'd seen what it did to women, how it nearly killed them, but you had no reliable way to prevent it. And so you prayed your courses would keep coming and tried not to think about what would happen if they didn't. Menstruation on the trail was its own special misery. You had no proper supplies, just rags that had to be washed and reused, soaked in your own blood, scrubbed in cold streams, never quite getting clean. You had to manage it while walking, while cooking, while caring for children, with no privacy, no comfort, no way to rest when the cramps were bad. You'd walk through the pain, work through it, because there was no alternative. The men never asked if you were menstruating, never acknowledged it might affect your ability to work. It was a woman's problem, meant to be invisible, handled silently. The emotional labor was even more exhausting than the physical. You were expected to keep the family's spirits up, to maintain a cheerful attitude, to not complain even when you were exhausted and hurting and afraid. When your husband was discouraged, you encouraged him. When the children were afraid, you comforted them. When someone died, you helped the grieving family while processing your own grief. Women held the emotional center of the train together, absorbing everyone else's fears and sadness and stress, with nowhere to release their own. You had no privacy for your own emotions. You couldn't break down crying because the children would see and be frightened. You couldn't rage at the unfairness because it would upset your husband or be seen as weakness. You couldn't even admit how much you resented this journey sometimes, because you'd agreed to come, and questioning that decision now helped no one. So you swallowed it all, pushed it down, and kept working. Some women kept diaries, and you'd read excerpts later that revealed the truth, the bone-deep exhaustion, the resentment at husbands who'd dragged them into this, the grief for the life left behind, the fear that this was all for nothing. I felt I could go no further, one woman wrote. My feet were blistered, my children crying, my husband was short-tempered, and I wanted to lie down in the prairie and die, but she didn't. None of them did. They kept going. The lack of privacy was maddening. You'd been raised with Victorian modesty. A woman didn't undress in front of anyone but her husband, didn't discuss bodily functions, maintained propriety at all times. On the trail, there was no privacy. You changed clothes in the wagon, hoping no one would peek through the canvas. You relieved yourself behind the wagon or a bush, hoping the same. You bathed in rivers when you got the chance, rarely, with other women, creating a human curtain for modesty. All of you cold and exposed, and trying to scrub months of dirt off in minutes. Maintaining any sense of femininity or modesty was nearly impossible, and you watched it erode in yourself and others. Watched women become harder, coarser, less concerned with propriety, because survival mattered more than manners. Your hands told the story of the trail. Back home, you'd tried to keep them soft, using butter or cream, wearing gloves for rough work. On the trail, your hands became tools. They were calloused and cracked, the skin rough as leather, nails broken and dirty, cuts and burns at various stages of healing. These were hands that built fires and scrubbed laundry on rocks, and kneaded bread dough and lifted children and carried water and did 1,000 other tasks daily. They were hands that would never be soft again. Your body changed in other ways too. You'd lost weight. Your monthly cycles had become irregular from stress and malnutrition. Your hair was dull and brittle from constant sun and poor diet. Your skin was weathered far beyond your years. You were 32 and looked 50. The mirror, on the rare occasions you saw one, showed a stranger, gaunt, hard, worn. The woman you'd been in Missouri was gone, replaced by someone capable of survival but hollowed out by the cost. And yet, the strength required was extraordinary. You walked 15 miles daily while pregnant or carrying a child. You cooked over open fires in all weather. You nursed the sick and dying. You gave birth and kept moving. You managed children's fears and husbands' moods and your own terror. And you did it all while maintaining the routines that kept everyone alive. The strength wasn't celebrated, wasn't even acknowledged most of the time, but it was there in every woman on that trail. A kind of ferocious endurance that kept families moving toward Oregon. Some women didn't make it. You'd see graves marked wife and mother, and you'd know she died doing exactly what you were doing, working herself to death for her family's dream. Sometimes women just gave up mentally, becoming hollow-eyed and silent, going through motions, but no longer really present. Sometimes they died of disease or childbirth or accidents. Sometimes they survived the trail but never recovered, arriving in Oregon broken in ways that never healed. But mostly, women survived. Not unchanged. Everyone who made the trail was changed but survived. You survived through sheer stubbornness, and because your children needed you, and because turning back was impossible and giving up meant death. You survived by making yourself harder, by learning to ignore pain, by developing the ability to work through exhaustion that would have felled you 6 months earlier at night. Lying next to your husband who fell asleep immediately after his work was done. You'd stare at the canvas wagon cover and think about the women who'd walked this route before you, who were walking it now in other trains, who'd walk it in years to come. Thousands of women, all carrying the same invisible burden, all doing the labor that made the journey possible while the men got credit for the adventure. You'd think about your daughters. Would you want this for them? Would you encourage them to take this journey? Or would you tell them the truth about what it cost? You didn't know. You only knew that tomorrow you'd wake before the horn, build the fire, make breakfast, manage the children, walk 15 miles, cook dinner, do laundry, put everyone to bed, and somehow survive another day. Because that's what women did on the trail. They survived, invisibly, carrying the weight of everyone else's dreams on shoulders that were never supposed to be strong enough, but somehow were. Arrival, the bitter reality. You see the Willamette Valley for the first time from a mountain pass, and it's beautiful, lush and green, rivers cutting through fertile bottomland, forests of enormous trees stretching to the horizon. It looks like paradise after 6 months of dust and death and endless walking. Your children point and exclaim, excited finally to be arriving. Your husband stands straighter, vindicated, saying, "See, I told you it would be worth it." And you want to feel relief, joy, triumph. But mostly, You just feel numb and impossibly tired. The descent from the mountains is treacherous, the trail is steep, rocky, muddy in places, and wagons have to be lowered with ropes to keep them from running away and smashing to pieces. You've heard stories of families making it all the way across the plains and mountains, only to lose everything here. Wagons tipping and tumbling down slopes, people injured or killed in the final stretch. Your wagon makes it down intact, but you're too exhausted to feel grateful. You just accept it as one more thing you've survived. You reach Oregon City in late October, 5.5 months after leaving Independence. The town is smaller than you imagined, rough wooden buildings, muddy streets, a few hundred people who look at your wagon train with a mixture of welcome and assessment. They can tell you're new emigrants, can see it in your worn clothes and gaunt faces and exhausted animals. Merchants approach immediately, offering supplies at inflated prices, land for sale, services you can't afford. The reality hits quickly. You thought you'd arrived, but you've only reached the starting line of a different kind of struggle. Your husband goes to the land office to file a claim. This is what you came forth, 320 acres of free land, yours to clear and farm and build upon, except it's not quite free. There are filing fees, survey costs, requirements to improve the land by building and farming within a certain time frame. And the land available isn't the fertile valley bottomland you saw from the mountains that's already claimed, taken by earlier emigrants or by the Hudson's Bay Company or by people who've been here for years. The available claims are farther out in areas that need clearing, often on hillsides or in locations without easy water access. Your husband chooses a claim site 15 miles from Oregon City, sight unseen except for a rough description. You travel there the next day with what's left of your supplies you've sold or traded a lot just to get money for fees and immediate necessities, and when you arrive, your heart sinks. It's forest, dense, old-growth forest with trees so enormous your husband has to crane his neck to see the tops. Beautiful, yes, but completely unworkable without massive labor. Every acre will have to be cleared before you can plant anything. Trees cut down, stumps removed, ground broken. It will take years to get even a small section into production. There's no house. Obviously, there's no house. This is raw land, unclaimed until an hour ago. There's no barn, no well, no cleared fields, no nothing. Just forest and a creek running through it and a piece of paper from the land office saying, "This is now yours if you can prove it up." Your husband looks excited, seeing potential. You look at your children, at the wagon that's barely holding together, at the rapidly approaching winter, and feel panic rising in your throat. That first night on your own land, you camp like you have for 6 months, because what else can you do? The wagon is your home still. You cook over an open fire. You sleep on the ground. But this time, there's no wagon train around you, no other families within sight. Just the dark forest pressing in on all sides. And you have no answer because you don't know. Your husband starts cutting trees the next day. It's brutal work. These trees are massive, old-growth fir and cedar, some of them 8 feet across at the base. With just an axe and a saw, he can maybe fell and limb one decent-sized tree in a day of hard labor. And you need to clear acres. The math is devastating when you work it out. At this rate, It will take months just to clear enough space for a small cabin and a garden plot. Meanwhile, winter is coming. The rains start, and you discover that Oregon rain isn't like rain back home. It's relentless, cold, soaking, turning everything to mud. The wagon canvas leaks. Everything is damp. You can't keep a fire going for cooking. The children are cold and miserable and getting sick. You've survived 6 months of trail only to possibly die in the Oregon rain. Because you have no proper shelter, your husband rushes to build a shelter, not a real cabin. There's no time, just a lean-to against the wagon. Logs chinked with mud, a roof of cedar bark. It keeps off some of the rain, but not all. Smoke from the fire fills the cramped space, making everyone cough. You're living like animals, you think, after sacrificing everything to get here. This is the dream. This is what was supposed to make it all worthwhile. Money becomes an immediate problem. You have almost none. The journey consumed most of your cash, and you need things desperately: nails, tools, seeds for spring planting, food to supplement what you have left, because your supplies won't last until a first harvest, medicine because the children have coughs that won't quit. Your husband tries to find work. There's usually demand for labor in Oregon City, but that means leaving you and the children alone at the claim while he's gone for days or weeks. And you're terrified of being alone in the forest with children. No real shelter, and who knows what dangers. You learn quickly that many emigrants arrive broke, desperate, disillusioned. Some give up on their land claims almost immediately, selling them cheap or abandoning them to work in town. Others struggle for years, barely surviving, watching the dream of prosperous farming remain always just out of reach. The lucky ones had money saved, could hire help to clear land, could buy proper tools and supplies. Your family is not lucky. The community of emigrants is both a blessing and a problem. Everyone helps each other because everyone needs help: barn raisings, harvest assistance, shared tools, trading labor. But everyone is also competing for the same scarce resources, the same markets for their future crops, the same limited paying work. And beneath the cooperation is judgment. Families who struggle are seen as lazy or incompetent. Women who complain are told they should have stayed back east. Children who don't thrive are evidence of poor parenting. The social pressure to appear successful, to vindicate the journey, is intense. You meet other women, hear their stories. One woman lost her husband and 2 children on the trail and arrived alone with 3 surviving children, all under 10. She's living in a tent on her claim, trying to clear land with children as her only help. Another woman's family arrived intact but broke, and they're sharecropping someone else's already cleared land. Basically, indentured servants working for a percentage of crops. The dream of owning land now postponed indefinitely. Another family lost everything when their wagon tipped. In the final mountain descent, they have literally nothing but the clothes they wore, and are dependent entirely on charity. And there are success stories that make you feel worse. Families who came 2 years earlier and now have cabins, cleared fields, crops coming in, a foothold on prosperity. They're kind about helping newer emigrants, but their success highlights your struggle, makes you wonder what you're doing wrong, why your family can't seem to get ahead. The winter is survival mode, again, just like the trail, but different. You're not walking 15 miles daily, but you're cold and wet constantly, living in a lean-to that barely qualifies as shelter, rationing food, watching your children's health deteriorate from the conditions. You cook what you can over a smoky fire, do laundry in the freezing creek, try to keep everyone's spirits up while feeling your own hope eroding. This isn't what you imagined. This isn't the promised land of opportunity. This is just a different kind of hardship. And you've given up everything: family, home. 3 people from your wagon train who died along the way for this. Your husband works himself nearly to death, clearing land. Every day he's out there with the axe, taking down trees, cutting them into logs for a future cabin, burning stumps, breaking ground. He comes back at night exhausted, hands blistered and bleeding, barely able to eat before collapsing into sleep. You watch him age in real time, watch the hope in his eyes dim as he realizes how much work this will be, how many years before the land produces anything, how far the reality is from the dream. Some nights, lying in the lean-to, listening to rain drum on the cedar bark roof, you think about home, your parents' house, warm and solid, your mother's kitchen, the rocking chair you sold, the life you gave up. You wonder if they think about you, if they worry, if they've received any of your letters. You wonder what you'd tell them if you could send a message right now, an honest message. Would you say it was worth it? Would you encourage others to come? You don't know. You honestly don't know. But slowly, impossibly slowly, things improve. By spring, your husband has cleared enough space for a real cabin's mall. 1 room, but solid, with a real roof and a door and a floor raised off the mud. It's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, that little cabin, because it means you're no longer camping, no longer temporary. You have a home. It's crude and drafty, and the furniture is rough-hewn logs, but it's yours. You plant a garden seeds you carried all the way from Missouri, some you traded for in Oregon City. Potatoes, beans, squash, carrots. You tend it obsessively, checking daily for sprouts, pulling weeds, praying for sun and rain in the right measures. When the first plants emerge, you cry with relief. Food, growing food, the beginning of self-sufficiency. The community builds around you too. More immigrants arrive. They'll keep arriving for decades, and you help them the way others helped you, sharing knowledge about which seeds grow best, where to find clay for chinking, how to preserve food for the long winters. You form bonds with other women, friendships forged in shared struggle, and these relationships become your lifeline, the thing that makes the isolation bearable. Your children adapt in ways you couldn't have predicted. They're wild compared to how they'd have grown up in Missouri, running through the forest, climbing enormous trees, fishing in the creek, helping with farm work from young ages. They don't remember Missouri much anymore. This is their life now, and they accept it with the resilience of childhood. Your oldest daughter, now 11, can handle an axe better than most boys back home could. Your sons are learning to farm, hunt, survive in the wilderness. They'll grow up as Oregonians, and maybe for them, this will have been worth it years later, because you do survive those first brutal years. You'll have a functioning farm, not prosperous exactly, but stable, crops growing, animals raised, a real cabin with additions, furniture your husband built, quilts you pieced from precious fabric scraps. You'll have community, church on Sundays in a rough building everyone helped construct, school for the children taught by a woman who came west teaching. You'll have neighbors within a few miles, other families who made the same journey, who understand without needing to be told what it cost. And sometimes you'll think about the trail, about the 6 months of walking and dying and suffering that brought you here. You'll think about the 11 people from your wagon train who died along the way, buried in graves you'll never visit. You'll think about everything you left behind, family, possessions, the woman you used to be, and you'll wonder, was it worth it? The answer is complicated. Your children have land, opportunity, a future that might have been denied them back east. Your husband proved up the claim, and you'll pass it on someday. You survived. But the cost was enormous, and there are days when you're not sure the math works out. When you think maybe you could have been just as happy staying in Missouri, living a smaller life, but keeping everyone you loved alive and close. But you don't say these thoughts out loud, because Oregon needs a story about itself, about brave pioneers and manifest destiny and the triumph of American expansion. Your doubt doesn't fit that story. So you stay quiet, and when new emigrants arrive, asking if the journey was worth it, you say yes, because what else can you say? You've committed. There's no going back. This is your life now, and maybe, eventually, if you live long enough, see grandchildren born on this land, watch the forest you helped clear become productive farm. Witness the community grow and thrive. Maybe then you'll believe your own reassurances. Maybe then the cost will seem justified. Maybe. But tonight, that first winter, in the leaky lean-to, with your children coughing and your husband too tired to speak and the rain falling endlessly, you just feel tired, so impossibly tired. And you wonder how many more years of being tired you have in you, and whether you'll survive them, and what version of yourself will exist on the other side. Closing reflection. Why they did it anyway. Between 1840 and 1870, approximately 400,000 people made the journey along the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails. 400,000. That's a number large enough to fill a modern city. But these weren't residents settling into established infrastructure. These were individuals and families, each making a conscious choice to walk 2,000 miles across hostile territory with no guarantee of survival or success. And they kept coming year after year, even as stories of hardship and death filtered back east. Even as the trail became lined with graves, even as everyone knew the risks. Why? The easy answer is land. Free land, or nearly free, in quantities that were unimaginable back east, where every acre was already claimed, already expensive, already divided among families who'd been there for generations. 320 acres was wealth, was legacy, was the chance to build something that would outlast you and benefit children and grandchildren you'd never meet. For families scraping by on small plots or working someone else's farm for wages, the promise of land ownership was intoxicating. It represented not just economic opportunity, but dignity, independence, the American ideal of a yeoman farmer beholden to no one. But land alone doesn't explain it. People had land back east, maybe not much, maybe not the best land, but land nonetheless. And the cost of acquiring Oregon land, when you calculated honestly, was astronomical. Not just the $1,000 to outfit for the journey, but the physical cost, the risk of death, the certainty of suffering, the probable loss of everything you'd built in your previous life. The math didn't really work unless you valued the Oregon land at something approaching infinite worth, which meant the migration was never really about rational economic calculation. It was about something else. It was about hope, that uniquely human capacity to believe things will be better somewhere else, that suffering now will lead to prosperity later, that the next place will finally be the place where everything works out. Hope is powerful enough to make people walk away from everything familiar, to risk their children's lives, to endure months of hardship, all for a promise that might be lies. And in the 1840s and 1850s, America was selling hope by the way, promising a Garden of Eden just 2,000 miles west, yours for the taking. Manifest destiny, the idea that American expansion across the continent was not just desirable, but divinely ordained, inevitable, part of the nation's purpose, gave the migration a sense of righteous purpose. You weren't just seeking personal gain, you were participating in the grand national project of spreading American civilization from sea to sea. This framing made the suffering noble, the deaths meaningful sacrifices for progress. It absolved emigrants of questioning whether they were actually invaders, displacing indigenous peoples whose land this was. It turned a fundamentally selfish act seeking better land for your family at the expense of others into patriotic duty. For some, the migration was about escaping failure. Back east, you'd struggled and couldn't get ahead, and the reasons were complex. Bad luck, poor choices, structural economic forces you couldn't control. But Oregon offered a reset button, a chance to start over where no one knew your failures, where the slate was clean. The appeal of reinvention, of becoming someone new in a new place, drove many emigrants as much as the land itself. Oregon was where you could pretend your past didn't exist, where you could build an identity from scratch. For others, it was about adventure, especially the young men who drove much of the initial migration. The trail was dangerous, yes, but it was also the greatest adventure available to an ordinary person in the mid-19th century. Reading guidebooks and emigrant letters was the closest thing to consuming adventure media that existed. And for young men chafing under the routine of farm labor or apprenticeships, the trail offered escape into something larger, more exciting, more meaningful than ordinary life. Many of them died, of course, but some survived and lived the rest of their lives, dining out on their trail stories. The hardship transformed through memory into heroic narrative. And then there's the momentum of migration itself. Once a few families from your town or county went to Oregon, others followed, because humans are social creatures who follow patterns and don't want to be left behind. If your neighbor sold everything and went west, suddenly your own life felt smaller, more limited, less ambitious. The migration created its own pressure, a sense that staying behind meant missing out on history, being left in the past while others moved into the future. Entire communities sometimes migrated together, trying to recreate familiar social structures in new territory. And that collective movement made the individual decision easier. You weren't going into the unknown alone. You were going with people you knew. The women's reasons were often different from the men's, though less documented. Some women genuinely wanted to go, believed in the promise of Oregon, welcomed the adventure. But many went because their husbands decided, And in the 1840s, a wife didn't have much choice. If your husband said the family was going to Oregon, you went, or you stayed behind and lost your family. The diaries and letters that survive from women on the trail reveal ambivalence, doubt, fear, and often outright resentment. "If I could have had my way, we never would have left," one woman wrote. But she went anyway because the alternative was worse. What's remarkable is not that people, when humans, have always migrated in search of better conditions, but that they kept going even after the truth became widely known. By the late 1840s, accurate information about the trail's dangers was available. Newspapers published letters from emigrants describing the deaths, the hardship, the disappointments. The Donner Party tragedy was national news. Cholera epidemics on the trail were well documented. The romantic myths were being challenged by hard reality. And yet the wagons kept rolling west, 400,000 people over 3 decades. Each one believing they'd be different, they'd be lucky, they'd be the ones who made it through intact. That's faith, in a way faith that borders on delusion. Faith that you're special, that your family is strong enough, that God or luck or determination will spare you from the fate that took others. Faith that the promise of Oregon is real, despite evidence to the contrary. That the land will be everything you hoped, that the suffering will be temporary and the rewards permanent. Without that faith, no one would go. But with it, people convinced themselves that walking 2,000 miles across a death trap was a reasonable decision. And here's the thing, for some of them, it worked. Some families arrived in Oregon, cleared their land, built prosperous farms, raised healthy children who inherited that land and built their own prosperity. The success stories became legends, told and retold, used to recruit more emigrants, enshrined in the American mythology of westward expansion. Never mind that these were the minority. Most families struggled for years or even generations. Many gave up and moved to towns or back east. Some were destroyed by the experience. The successful ones became the proof that justified the journey. You have to wonder what the people who died on the trail would have said if they could speak. The woman who died of cholera and left for children orphaned, would she say the risk was worth taking? The man who drowned at a river crossing, whose family had to continue without him, would he encourage others to follow? The children who fell under wagon wheels, or died of fever, or simply didn't have the strength to survive the journey, what would their voices add to the story? We don't hear from the dead, only from the survivors. And survivors have an incentive to believe it was all worthwhile, because otherwise they have to face that they suffered for nothing. The Oregon Trail represents something fundamental about human nature. Our capacity for hope, delusion, courage, and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. It takes courage to leave everything and walk into the unknown. It takes hope to believe that unknown will be better. It takes delusion to minimize the very real risks. And it takes stubbornness to keep going once you've realized the dream is harder than promised. Because turning back means admitting failure, means the suffering was for nothing. In the end, maybe the question, was it worth it, is the wrong question. Worth is subjective, calculated differently by everyone who made the journey. For some, landing in Oregon and claiming land made every hardship worthwhile. For others, the trail broke them in ways they never recovered from, and no amount of land could justify the cost. For the ones who died along the way, The journey was definitively not worth it. Though we can't ask them and their families might disagree. Perhaps the better question is, why are humans like this? Why do we chase horizons? Why do we believe in fresh starts? Why do we convince ourselves that suffering now will lead to reward later? Why do we take catastrophic risks for uncertain gains? The Oregon Trail is just one example among thousands throughout human history of people migrating, exploring, invading, colonizing, always searching for something better, always willing to pay enormous costs for the possibility of improvement. There's something beautiful and tragic about it. Beautiful because it shows human resilience, optimism, determination, the qualities that have allowed our species to spread across the globe and survive conditions that should have killed us. Tragic because those same qualities lead us to inflict suffering on ourselves and others, to displace indigenous peoples, to die in deserts and mountains chasing dreams that may not exist tonight. As you drift toward sleep, think about those 400,000 people. Think about the mothers walking beside wagons, the children who grew up on the trail, the men who broke their bodies clearing forests, the ones who died and were buried in unmarked graves. Think about the native peoples who watched their land invaded, who tried to help and were repaid with displacement. Think about the oxen who pulled wagons until they died. Think about all the suffering that went into building the American West, all the blood and tears and broken dreams that soaked into the dirt of the Oregon Trail. And think about the fact that even knowing all this, even understanding the full cost, many of those people would probably make the same choice again, because hope is irrational. Because humans need to believe we can change our circumstances. Because standing still feels like dying slowly. And at least the trail offered the possibility of something different, even if that difference might be death. The wagons don't roll west anymore. The Oregon Trail is a historical site, marked with monuments and interpretive signs, sanitized for tourists. But the impulse that filled those wagons, the hunger for something better, the willingness to risk everything for possibility, that's still with us. We still chase horizons. We still convince ourselves that the next place, the next job, the next relationship will be the one that finally works out. We still walk away from stability toward uncertainty, hoping we're moving toward something better and not just trading one set of problems for another. Maybe that's the legacy of the Oregon Trail, not the land that was claimed or the West that was built, but the reminder of what humans will endure in service of hope. 400,000 people walked 2,000 miles because they believed in tomorrow. Many of them died. Most of them suffered. Some of them found what they were looking for. All of them were human, beautifully and tragically human, doing the thing humans have always done, walking toward the horizon, believing that this time, finally, we'll find what we're looking for. Sleep well. And remember them, all of them, the successful and the failures, the quick and the dead, the dreamers and the realists, everyone who walked the trail. They deserve to be remembered honestly, without romance, without judgment, just as people who tried to build better lives and paid whatever price that required. They were complicated, flawed, hopeful, desperate, strong, broken, just like us, just like everyone who's ever chased a dream, knowing it might destroy them, and gone anyway. Good night.